I've decided to make a video about a common Final Fantasy XIV argument again. This one's slightly less common than the last one. I only saw it flare up once while making this video, and not even on Twitter this time. But I think it's one with a much longer legacy. I don't think I can remember a time in this game's community when I wasn't seeing this spring up every so often. You see a bunch of different versions of it, but I can generally summarize it as, why haven't we killed the elementals yet? And the answer to that is multifaceted, but so are the reasons people ask in the first place. The elementals, for not turning up much at all, are a pretty complex subject, and a lot of people have a lot of feelings about them. So today, we're going to talk about both of those. Why we haven't fought the elementals, both in-universe and out-of-universe, and why people really want us to do that anyway. Spoiler warning for the main story and the Endwalker tank role quests, and kinda some other things, but nothing super deep. And an opinion warning, because I have them. So with that, please shoot me a like, subscribe and all that if you're into this, and let's get to it.
In accordance with the will of the elementals, we have embraced a life of peace. Alas, our neighbors have not always sought the same for themselves, nor for us.
When we did a review for Y'shtola, we went in-universe chronologically because that made sense for the question we were asking about her. That is not true for the elementals, because we are exclusively focused on our perception of and relationship to them as players with the character in the actual story. So that means retracing this from our perspective, and that means starting in 1.0. Out of all the original 3 starting regions, Gridania famously saw the most change from 1.0. Now, a big part of that was its famously awful, terrible map. Yes, this is the actual map, and you were expected to go through it frequently. Yeah, I can't imagine why 1.0 flopped. Anyway, one of the other big changes was in the elementals, who were a lot more active. In fact, basically the first thing that happens in the Gridanian storyline is that they responded to Ida and Papalymo as new, foreign elements to the forest by summoning up a Treant against them. Also worth noting that this is through an Echo flashback, but 1.0's Echo flashbacks are treated more like you actively reliving the experience, so while the player was depicted as being there, they, weren't. It makes looking back at these cutscenes very confusing. We also learned the Moogles were essentially the elementals' attendants, and they still are. Still, this welcome is explained as sort of the expected response to newcomers to the Shroud though. Almost the reflexive antibodies, and the first thing we need to do on getting into Gridania is to perform some cleansing rites to rid us of the Green Wrath, which is sort of a negative karma that you get from living in a way the elementals aren't fond of. We only had a small amount from just not being locals, and it's such a known thing that they apparently hold regular cleansing rites anyway. We hear from Gava actually, the leatherworker trainer that only I actually like as a person, that everyone in Gridania lives in accordance with their rules, and it's just a natural thing, they get used to it. There's originally a belief that the player character Ida and Papalymo were beckoned by the elementals, silently called to the 12's Wood to perform a task that even they're not aware of. For Ida and Papalymo, this isn't really explained, but for the player character it was probably to help a particular child, if it was ever true in the first place. So, if that's what happens when someone's basically just a neutral intruder that hasn't done anything wrong, what happens when someone has actively done something wrong? Well, we're introduced to that in the form of wildlings, which are people who've been actively infested and almost sorta zombified by the elementals. The actual state is not clearly explained. This includes some family members of local kids, which set one of them, Krim, into a bit of a rage, trying to prove the elementals weren't even real in the first place. He does this by setting fire to a tree, which it turns out is an absurdly bad idea, because it very directly enrages one of the elementals who probably would have killed some people if Isumi Yan weren't there to quell it at the time. Instead, Krim is basically petrified until the conjurers can cleanse him of his green wrath. After that, the main story stopped focusing on the elementals, but they come up in a couple of side quests. One of them apparently had the elementals just straight up disintegrating someone, but I can't find more information there. 1.0 stuff is inconsistently archived. But later, when jobs got added in patches, one of the elementals became the focus of White Mage's quests. We've mentioned this before, but while most of 1.0's job quest lines were straight imported into A Realm Reborn, White Mage's was changed significantly, probably because in 1.0 it was about dealing with an elemental. The elemental in question, Ohar Sok, was a very nihilistic one, and was implied to be the one responsible for the 5th Umbral Calamity, the one that ended the War of the Magi. This is where the general idea that the elementals caused that flood came from, but it should be noted that nothing from A Realm Reborn onwards ever even implies this. There was also a scene in the 1.x patches where the Garleans weaponized the elementals, setting fire to parts of the forest to cause them to just go berserk and attack the wood whalers for them. This suggests the elementals can't actually tell the difference between people, but if I'm completely honest, this scene doesn't make a lot of sense, and contradicts most elemental scenes both before and after it. Like, surely, even if they only tell people apart through Green Wrath, they should be able to tell the difference here, right? That wraps up what the 1.0 story said about the elementals. It's speculated they might have been an intended subject for later in that game plan, but it's not clear. But there is one other thing to note. See, in the live game, the elementals are largely intangible entities, but in 1.0, they actually appeared as hostile mobs. Given that, is there anything that we could have learned from how they actually fought? Well, I can't find any information on how they fought, but I can tell you, in a game where the maximum level was 50, the elementals spawned at level 90. So yeah, that's some pretty good gameplay and story synergy to say that they are considerably above our pay grade. A Realm Reborn introduces a significant but understated change to their status quo. After helping with the Ermine Hedge, a barrier to protect the Shroud from the Calamity, the elementals themselves are much weaker now. The Shroud's people mostly don't change in demeanor. There's still a lot of reverence for and an acceptance of their rules, and this turns the Pajali and the Hearers from less of a mediator role, although there's still some of that going on, and much more of a protector. However, this has also led to an increase in poachers, brigands, and other sorts that the elementals tended to hate the practices of. Most of their presence in A Realm Reborn is in the abstract of people talking about them and the faith around them, rather than them being directly relevant. The one time in the main story that this is more than just set dressing is when there's an injured Alamegan out near Quarry Mill, a man named Galleon. You try to get the conjurers to help, but they basically just stonewall you. The elementals aren't fond of Alamegans since the Autumn War about a century ago, so the conjurers either just can't heal the guy or don't want to risk making them mad by doing it. His people instead brew an Alamegan remedy to help the guy, which does seem to work, and he appears in a Dark Knight quest much later on, but that part's not important right now. The actual stories looking at the elementals are class and job quests though, and they also give us some windows into stuff that's hard to find an opening for. So, welcome to Tangent City. The Lancer questline is focused around a Duskwhite who's got a lot of hatred against Gridania. The elementals aren't directly involved here, but they are deeply relevant to the story of the Duskwhite. After the 5th Calamity, regardless of if the elementals caused it, Elazin, likely from Amdapor, and Cure migrants went underground in hiding from them, because apparently the elemental's influence doesn't extend, down. These Elazin and Hure founded Gelmora, and for a good few centuries, that was the main city-state in the Shroud. Eventually, the Ixal kicking around above ground got people interested in the idea that they might be able to move up though, and a group of apparently mostly Hyur mages tried beseeching the elementals. Eventually their leader, Joran Lightheart, did a thing that really pleased them and got those groups right to move above ground, founding what would eventually become Gridania. Soon after, Joran's family had a child with horns, the first Pajali. Some amount of Elezen didn't leave Galmora though, for unknown reasons. Might be something big, ancient and secret, might just be refusing to give up their homeland. We don't know, both legit. But eventually, these different populations led to different appearances, as the above-ground Elezen became the Wildwood, and the below-ground Elezen became the Duskwhite. These days Galmora seems basically abandoned, but the Duskwhite live on as a bit of a maligned and marginalized minority. The Elementals are the root cause of this divide, but at this point that's more trivia than pertinent fact. Our best look at the relationship to the Elementals, of course, comes from the Conjurer and White Mage's questlines. From here we learn that a big part of the Conjurer's job is to actually aid the Elementals by quelling whatever causes problems. This largely involves finding and cleansing tainted ether. The Elementals need help to rid the Shroud of that, and the Conjurers provide when the Elementals can't do it themselves. With White Mage, that story continues, but we also learn more about the Pajali. They're always Hyur children, and they stop aging somewhere in their teen. Canny Senna's using a glamour to look older because people tend not to take a child seriously in diplomacy, and you know what? Our own evidence tends to agree with her there. Still, their role is to be the direct conduit between the Elementals and man, and to take on bigger, less routine problems. To that end, they're the only permitted wielders of white magic until the Warrior of Light was just too aggressively special for that rule to hold. That's not an elemental-centric thing, the Pajali just sort of decided that part themselves. They've mostly cloistered themselves in the Shroud to make sure to keep the Elementals safe and happy, but the Elementals are also concerned about things outside of there, including tainted ether from elsewhere that can float into the Shroud, or a newborn Pajali hanging around outside of their bounds. After A Realm Reborn and its side content, we have most of our functional knowledge based on the Elementals. Heavensward brings us relatively little here, aside from that one White Mage quest, but in the main story, the Pajali do successfully get the Elementals to help in pulling Y'shtola back out of the life stream. So whenever you hear anyone ask, what have the Elementals ever done for us? There you go. From Stormblood onwards, the Elementals are just completely irrelevant to the main story, but Stormblood does shed some light on them in the sidelines. In Stormblood Leatherworker, one of my Dark Horse favourite storylines, you don't expect that one to go as hard as it does, we learn that at least one hero has just been making up what he claims are the Elementals' wishes, rather than only ever speaking for them. Specifically, he was vehemently anti-taxidermy for whatever reason. Making those claims are probably a lot easier when they're relatively quiet like they have been recently. This isn't necessarily new info on the Elementals, but it does tell us that the overall public perception of them might not be, 100% accurate. Much more interesting in Stormblood, though, is that in Eureka we find other Elementals. They use the exact same model, which at this point had only appeared in one quest in the live game. In Eureka, they're not violent, and just give us some handy buffs. We've talked about all that before in my Eureka video, but one thing I missed because I didn't actually know at that time, apparently Absolute Virtue is an elemental that got corrupted by taking hold of one of the Eurekan weapon primals. I don't know what to make of that, honestly. It might be that it was a Eurekan elemental, but all the other bosses in the Baldessian arsenal were collected from elsewhere by the students of Baldessian, so maybe it was also in the Shroud. All we really know there is... that's weird, right? I don't know what to make of it, it's just really weird. Shadowbringers brings us... nothing, actually. The Elementals don't come up at all, which is also weird. We just had an entire expansion without a peep from them. But Endwalker makes up for some major lost time by making them pretty much the main focus of the tank roll quest. See, the blasphemy summoned in the Shroud is mainly turning people and bringing despair by bringing symptoms comparable to the creeping death, an insect-borne plague that hit the Shroud's Hyur population a couple centuries ago. Naturally, this freaks out the Shroud's Hyur population, who beseech help from the Pajali, who can't do much because the elementals are also freaking out too much to lend a hand. But they do their best, led by Canny Senna. And in the process, she actually learns that the outer settlements in the Shroud, like Fulgord, Flode, and Camp Tranquil, actually feel pretty disenfranchised, not because Gridania has been actively leaving them in the lurch, but because the Pajali and the heroes are often too busy handling the elementals to even go that far out in the first place. And of course, we have to mention that Gridania's blasphemy was actually an ex-Pajali, who was training with Canny Senna in their youth. He was actually even more fervent a believer than her, but when he helped a man who was actually deceiving him and aiming to take out a tree, possibly a nod to that 1.0 story, he got de-Pajali'd, which can apparently happen. The plan to deal with the blasphemy becomes two-pronged. While still making sure the Hyur are safe and well enough to not turn, we also work to quell the elementals. If you're also a white mage, you can bring up the quieting for the white mage quest, although that's not going to work this time. Instead, what works is to reenact what Joran did to first get the elementals' favor, which it turns out was just planting a bunch of saplings. This works well enough to get the main elemental, the Great One, to actually listen and provide help. And the final wrap-up of the quest is realizing both that the elementals need to be recognized as allies with needs of their own, and that Canny Senna and the other heroes should do a better job of reaching out to everyone outside Gridania too. And that's everything. Oh, except that there's elementals that are around in Elpis back in the ancient days. There's a quest about them that says that they, for some reason, communicate through ether rather than any form of traditional communication. There's suggestion by players that they're tasked with regulating ether that I've unfortunately repeated here before, but there's nothing actually saying that, although similar things are, so it wouldn't be impossible. They're also mentioned as not being very smart, which would kinda track with how near infantile they can seem when we deal with them. So, that's good to know, and might help figure out what exactly they are. But with all that, now we can answer that first question. Well, let's start with the in-universe factual reasons why we haven't done that, and probably won't do that in the future. First of all, nobody wants you to. The vast majority of people who've expressed any sort of opinion about the elementals at all are ambivalent at the absolute worst and generally pretty happy with the situation at best. The Alamegans are the only people who ever expressed outright dislike of them. Even they probably think you'd be going a bit too far by doing that for them. Yeah, the Duskwite had been put in a bad spot by them, but that was hundreds of years ago. These days their problems are vastly different and basically as unrelated as you can get while still being in the same forest. We've actually only hit two problems that directly connect to the elementals at all. One was that someone was falsely speaking on their behalf, which seems to me like a separate problem. And the other was actually solved by getting the elementals on side. Hell, even the kid that got petrified in 1.0 only burned that tree because he was trying to prove the elementals didn't exist in the first place. Once he learned, he actually became the pretty elemental-friendly Warden of the Woods. Killing the elementals isn't going to make anyone within the Shroud actually happy. As for the people outside the Shroud, well, that brings us to the next reason. Killing them is a bad idea that does nothing good, especially now. The elementals are actually just a huge part of why the Shroud is generally a pretty safe and productive place. They're tasked with protecting it, and do a pretty good job of it, all things considered. They're the main reason neither the Garleans nor the Alamegans really made any proper progress into the place. They're the only reason it didn't get blown away by Bahamut. I believe they also provide some aid for plant growth and harvest, but I can't find clear evidence of that. Back before the Calamity, They were a bit of a more present danger, but they were also a very understood one. Gridania had regularly held ceremonies to cleanse newcomers to the Shroud, and after that, it's a matter of adhering to rules that people never seem to struggle with. Even the carpenters and botanist guilds do absolutely fine, showing that those industries can exist under them. Granted, you're in trouble if you're an Alamegan who broke your leg, but you're actually no worse off in that state than you would be if you were anywhere else. If the elementals went down completely, you're actually just leaving the Shroud and its people not just completely worse off in terms of crop yield and the like, but also vulnerable to outside threats. Chances are the future of an elementals free Shroud is getting clear cut by the Ixol's industrial logging operation, which is a separate, complex problem that probably shouldn't be solved this way. And all of that's just the stuff we know they're in control of. It's very possible they're doing stuff that we'd only notice if they suddenly stopped doing it. Finally, well, let's actually throw out that last point entirely, because that's not going to happen. You will not be able to kill them. Remember, when they were mobs in 1.0, the elementals were level 90 in a level 50 game. Even if you take the honestly reductive view that this translates directly to us being level 90 now and thus a match for them. Well, first of all, I've seen the level 90 Savages and Ultimates. I would not call this reassuringly plausible. And that's without getting into their actual abilities, which again, include petrification, zombification, and very probably disintegration. I don't care how big your biceps are, you don't exactly level past those being immediate shutdown buttons. But there's another element that I think is constantly ignored in this conversation, but I think is a huge one. There's an S at the end of elementals. There's more than one. How many are you even picturing this fight being with? Well, I was curious, so I did a little poll on Reddit to see where people's minds are. Those answers generally drifted towards the higher end, but there's a reasonable diversity here. People aren't on the same page in how many of these guys there are. Neither am I, honestly, but I have one piece of evidence to chew on. When Krim burns the tree in 1.0, one comes out directly from it. I and a number of other people generally take that to mean the answer to how many elementals are there is essentially, well, how many trees are in the Shroud? And the number's probably bigger than that, because they're probably in other things too. If you're picking a fight with all the elementals, you're fighting a veritable horde, and some amount of them can just unmake you on sight if they want. But honestly, not only is all of that fairly forceful and hostile reasoning, and probably also not very convincing to the people who want that fight anyway, it's also not the important side of the story to consider this from. From an external, narrative perspective, why haven't the developers had us fight the elementals? After all, there'd certainly be an interesting fight. But that's not really what the point of their writing is, at least at this point. It's entirely possible 1.0 plans were different, but we don't know that, and that's not really relevant anymore. I think a key element in all of this is that we, as the largely Western audience watching an English video of Final Fantasy XIV, only see one of the two core inspirations that make up the elementals. We immediately identify the influence of European fae stories, of mysterious creatures in the woods with supernatural powers that were probably invented to scare children into not being terrible. But I think a much more important element is one we often miss: classical Japanese kami. It's why there's a Shinto vibe going on sometimes. Now, I'm conscious that this is a religion I know very little about, so I'll be light on this to avoid being too disrespectful. But the kami are generally seen as spirits that bring good fortune when happy and problems when angry. In fact, this is a concept that the game itself has taught the basics of, albeit in a different context. That angry, violent side of the soul is called the Aramitama, which you will recognize from the Four Lords story. Generally speaking, and again simplifying, the intention in Shinto is to cleanse these spirits that could reside in basically everything, with worship, prayer, and cleansings, to ensure that the Arta Mitama doesn't take control, instead being controlled by the calm, balanced side, the Nigi Mitama. The elementals might be wearing a different aesthetic and described with a different language, but in spirit they're the same as Japanese kami. They're the sorts of nature spirit that bring good fortune and health when happy, but when they're mad, they make a mountain explode, people die, and we just have to deal with that. We don't fight the elementals because that's not the story we're in with them. We're in a story informed by its roots in those Japanese myths and beliefs. We don't fight the elementals in the same way Shintoism doesn't fight the kami. We aim to quell their rage, to heal their pain, and to eventually understand them, so that we can benefit from their contented state. Now, as people who mostly didn't grow up with that faith, that's all a bit lost to us. But I think we can recognize it from a more broadly environmental angle. I don't expect all of you to be environmentalists, even if I myself am, but we should really be able to see what sort of story we'd be in if we fought the elementals.
You'll pay for this, Captain Planet!
Casting ourselves as Dr. Blight and Hoggish Greedly in a story where we hunt down nature spirits? That is not our story, but I don't think we'll get anywhere by just saying the people who want to fight the elementals are wrong. I think it helps to figure out why exactly people might be pushing for this in the first place. I apologize to everyone who came here really sharpening your nature spirit stabbing knives, because I'm about to start psychoanalyzing you based on what I've seen, and I might be getting things wrong. Like I said earlier, I personally think fighting elementals would be neat, because I think they have a neat power set. But here's the thing here. I know what it looks like when people are itching for a fight just because they think the fight will be cool. There's a tangible, almost innocent excitement and hype to that sort of speculation. It's what I see around the Myths of the Realm raids, a lot of where people were coming from when we learned we were going to fight Anima. But that is not the energy I see when people talk about fighting the elementals. No, there's like anger there. There is a genuine bloodthirst going. And since I assume at least most of those people aren't Captain Planet villains who invent cloning solely so that they can ruin one island's ecology, real Captain Planet plot by the way, it has to be something else. Rather than beat around the bush with alternate theories though, I'm just gonna say the main driving force as I see it, because I see it all over the place. I think people want to kill the elementals because we're playing a game where violence is the primary means of interaction. After all, when all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. I see this across a lot of RPGs actually, and I think it might be a root of that whole killing gods cliche. RPGs typically have an extremely large scale compared to other genres, and everything around you, especially the interesting things, is a potential foe. There just naturally reaches a point where everything that could be a potential foe must therefore become one. Therefore, if God is real, you must eventually have cause to stab him. Final Fantasy XIV is not so roundly simplistic a game in ideals or player tools. The main story has plenty of times when a problem is solved by avoiding violence, or at least aiming it elsewhere, and every single crafter or gatherer story tells you how well we can solve problems with completely non-violent means. But to some, that's not a central core of the story, it's just the unimportant sideline for the real main event, gratuitous violence up to and including deicide. And to a degree, that line of thought isn't completely wrong. Because yeah, while 14 is a game that wants to express the possibility of solving problems without violence, it's still a crowd pleaser at its heart. It still knows we want to throw down, and it'll give that to us whenever it can, even if it provides a generally non-antagonistic way to do it. Another time, the Mists of the Realm raids are strong examples, but I actually think the stronger one here is Hydaelyn, because of how many people were predicting it beforehand. Before Endwalker, honestly at any point between August 2013 and December 2021, I think everyone was in agreement that Zodiark was on the docket. The moment we learned the evil wizards had a dark god, we knew we were going to kill that thing sooner or later. But as time went on, and especially in the wake of Shadowbringers, that notion of fighting Hydaelyn came up too. There were piles of reasons for why we'd do that. Maybe she was the real villain after Zodiark. Maybe we're the only people that can stop her from draining ether like every primal. Maybe it was just an element of keeping balance, and so many more. There wasn't agreement for why we'd fight her. People simply saw a Hydaelyn fight as inevitable, to the point where it appeared in predictions in the same way they factored in things that we actually did know were coming. And you know what? They were right. The people who want to fight the elementals, I think, see that fight as similarly inevitable. Especially now. With Zodiark, Hydaelyn, and the Ascians gone, once we're done fighting the 12, the elementals are the strongest thing left that we haven't punched in the snout to assert dominance. So now comes the step of justification, and to that sort of person, that's rather an easy one. To someone that either misses or deliberately ignores the sympathetic angle and intentions that we've talked about, they can very easily be called the bad guys. They're discriminatory, they're oppressive, they're dangerous. I think a lot of them also read the more complex societal problems in the Shroud as directly caused by the elementals, so killing them will somehow solve Duskwhite racism or something. I feel like another big factor is the distorted second or third hand experience people tend to have with the elementals story in 1.0. The game of telephone that's resulted from most people never really looking at that story directly, and only ever hearing fragments about it, has painted them as these violent, ruthless things that cause nothing but harm. Because all that's really survived is the vague notion of the Green Wrath, of zombifying people for minor sins. At the same time, the sympathetic and understanding views of the populace, as well as the elemental's sheer power and, you know, the actual crimes they reacted to, they got left by the wayside. And a lot of people seem to weigh those vague, distorted retellings heavier than the live content for some reason. Either because it validates their argument, or maybe just because it's more obscure, so knowing it is worn like a badge of honor. That's a big thing in lore-knowing circles. I know more esoteric trivia than you, therefore my argument is stronger. The game's combat focus also makes it difficult for the writers to express the positive traits of the elementals. We'll never really notice or care about protection from disasters or bountiful crop yields, because those just aren't things that we have the capacity to notice or care about. We care about the violence in combat, so we only care about when the elementals go bad. Combine all that with the fact that I think a lot of RPG playing nerds are, for whatever various, often personal and often legitimate reasons, are rather skeptical of organized religion, that makes them pretty easy to loathe. You see it a lot around Ishgard stories too, especially the Endwalker caster role quest. But are those people right about where the game is going? The crowd-pleasing nature of the game means we must fight the thing they're itching to fight. I don't know, for one simple reason. This is basically an English language exclusive argument. I admit I have this info secondhand, and I don't know about, say, the German community. If you do, comment, I'm curious. But in the Japanese community, this just doesn't come up at all, because they get the Kami influence and the sympathetic angle. It's only in English where that part fell on deaf ears, predominantly among Americans. I think there's plausibly other cultural elements at play there too, this demand that the world must bend to their needs rather than listen to what anyone else needs. But I think that's a bit too heavy here. The future of this subject is a little binary though. Either that crowd-pleasing means we'll fight the elementals, or that part of the community just has to live with the fact they'll never get what they want. So I want to cap off here, as with the Y'shtola video, with a bit of a what if. Given everything we just talked about, let's entertain the hypothetical. If I am tasked with writing a story that leads to an elemental fight, how would I write it? Well, if I'm going dream mode writing, there's a few things I'd weave in, but I'll start with the elemental itself, because I think that's the easy part. I think there's a context where we'd fight an elemental that everyone, even those of us who have no problem with the things, would be immediately on board with, provided we lay the groundwork to reintroduce it. We're not going to fight just any elemental. We're going to fight Ohar Sok. Despite only being in 1.0, Ohar Sok and their legacy has managed to retain in the popular consciousness even more than the Encyclopedia Eorzea's much more readily stated explanation. Again, their story needs a bit of modernizing and dragging back into the spotlight, but I think they're very fitting for it. Especially because of one crucial element. They're lonely. And I'm saying that both because that's sympathetic, and because it solves that problem of there's a lot of elementals that'd gang up on us. Ohar Sok is the only elemental where it would be completely understandable if nobody came to their aid, including both the Pajal and other elementals. Yeah, Ohar Sok's kind of a dick. But we can't just fight Ohar Sok out of nowhere, especially because the story very rarely goes to Gridania, and, well, he's probably not hanging out in Mericidia. That'd feel weird. So, we need to make some context here. Make a story focused around the Shroud. And as luck would have it, we have an opportunity coming up. Remember variant dungeons? We've still got one unknown there. And I think a variant dungeon really digging into the Shroud's weird mysteries would do really well. So let's use that. In this little fantasy zone, our Shroud variant dungeon is Gelmorin, and Ohar Sok is one of its bosses. They could swing being one of the second tier branch enders if the devs didn't want to overfocus, which I'd understand if it were Gelmora. But I do think they'd be able to carry the weight of that secret final boss spot like the Thorn Knight. Seriously, even if you don't know them by name, just seeing an elemental get the boss intro sting would be just a really proper oh shit moment. But here's the big strength of a variant dungeon for this. It means the elemental doesn't take the sole spotlight. A variant dungeon is capable of juxtaposing multiple stories at once. Consider how Sildi managed to tell stories about Sildi itself, about the Amolja and the early Thorn dynasty, and about Nanamo's parents. A Shroud variant dungeon can do that. It can tell an elemental story without only telling an elemental story. And Gelmora would be great for that, because that brings in the Duskwhite as a really strong counter voice. I mentioned before that the elementals are a big part of their backstory, but far from the only part. And a variant dungeon could really help shine a light on that. Let us all know, through perhaps one of the Shroud's most famously maligned minorities, that the problems there don't start and end with the tree spirits. I think those two angles alone would do a lot to tell the right sort of story about the elementals, while still providing the satisfaction of a cool fight. It won't satisfy everyone. Some people want to grind their very specific axe no matter what, but I think it'd do the right job of being cathartic, or getting across that it's not so simple. But just one more thing. If I were doing this, I'd add a pointer to one more thing that's been bugging me. Remember that the elementals also turned up in Eureka, implicitly because the place is just completely etherically insane. If they are indeed regulators, which has been suspected, that would explain it. But perhaps that piece of evidence suggests we're not asking the right question about them. and we never have been. So, I would add some pointers to the right question. If the elementals turn up in places that are just kinda nuts etherically, what's going on in the 12's Wood that's warranted them being there for all this time? What if, this entire time, we've just been looking at the antibodies and completely missing the disease they're meant to fight? So, there we have it. The answer to why don't we kill the elementals, it turns out, is for literally every reason, but I get why you want to try. I like the idea of using these long-standing community questions as ways to explore popular characters and subjects, so if you can think of any others, please let me know, I'd love to do more. If you like this, please encourage me with YouTube buttons. Thank you so much for joining me, and I'll leave you with one more little thing. The elementals aren't primals. I couldn't find anywhere else to put this, but they've never been primals or even remotely resembled them, and no, nobody is tempered by them. Stop being weird about this.